My name is Courtney Palmer, 28, a wedding photographer who spends her days capturing the way love looks when it's real, soft, imperfect, full of light. But that afternoon, I learned how quickly love can disappear from your own story. Sunlight poured through my Seattle studio window as I laid out prints from last weekend's shoot, a bride's veil caught in autumn wind, the groom's eyes full of tears. I was lost in the quiet rhythm of my work when my phone lit up. Mom. I hesitated. We hadn't spoken much since Lily's engagement, but I still smiled when I answered. "Hi, Mom." Her voice was sharp, clipped, almost rehearsed. "Courtney, we need to talk about Lily's wedding." "I was just about to call her," I said, my heart light. "I have some ideas for the photography." "Don't." "Don't what?" "Don't come." The words hit harder than any scream. The mug slipped from my hand, shattering on the hardwood floor. Coffee splashed across my photos, those perfect smiles bleeding into brown stains. "Mom, you can't be serious. Lily deserves her moment. You'll only make it about yourself. Be kind. Stay away." I stood frozen, hearing only my own breath. I wanted to argue, to remind her I was her daughter too, but all I heard was that quiet finality, the sound of being erased. "I'm her sister," I whispered. "Exactly," she said. "Do something selfless for once." Her words lingered long after the call ended. I looked around at the wreckage, the broken cup, the ruined prints, the brown stains spreading across white paper, and realized it wasn't just coffee I was cleaning. It was every unspoken message I'd ever received. "You don't belong in the picture." The city moved on outside my window, traffic, laughter, life, but inside I stood still, watching my hands tremble over the fragments of glass. And in that moment I thought, maybe you've been there too. Maybe you've heard that same quiet rejection from someone who should have held you closer instead. If you have, please like this video and subscribe. Not for me, but so stories like ours don't fade into silence. Because sometimes a single click can remind someone out there that they're not alone. I sank to my knees, whispering into the empty room, "You told me not to come, but maybe one day I'll stop waiting for an invitation." The sound of that phone call kept echoing long after I hung up. I sat on the floor, surrounded by broken porcelain and photographs bleeding with coffee. The smell had already turned bitter the way milk does when left too long. I didn't move. I just stared. Then, through that silence, my mind started walking backward through years, through memories, through every quiet moment I'd chosen to forget. I remembered being 6. Lily was 4. She had curly blonde hair and a smile that could melt anyone. At every family gathering, people would say, "She's just like your mother." And then their eyes would slide over to me, quiet, dark-haired, too serious for my age, and they'd add, "And this one, well, she's the thinker." That was the first time I learned that love could be ranked, that there was a favorite, and it wasn't me. When Lily broke a vase, Mom laughed and said, "She's just a baby." When I spilled juice, it became a lecture about responsibility. And when I won my first photography award at 12, Dad said gently, "Let's not make too big a deal of it. You know how your sister feels when she's not in the spotlight." That night, he took the framed certificate off the living room wall and put it in my closet. That was the night I learned that achievement could be shameful if it made someone else uncomfortable. I used to think adulthood would change things, that if I worked hard enough, succeeded enough, they'd finally see me. But success only made me a threat. A few days after the phone call, I drove to my parents' house not to argue, but because I needed to see it one last time. The same porch light still flickered, the same wind chime still sang softly in the breeze. When Mom opened the door, her face didn't soften. It stayed composed, like a mask she'd worn too long to remove. "Courtney," she said, "you shouldn't have come." Inside, the house smelled like lavender and lemon polish the way it always had. On the mantel, photos of Lily and her fiancé covered every inch of space, not one of me. I asked quietly, "Do you really believe I'd ruin her day just by being there?" She sighed. "You make people look at you, Courtney, even when you don't mean to. And Lily, she needs this moment." I wanted to scream, "What about me?" But I didn't. because I'd spent my whole life trying not to sound ungrateful, not to sound difficult, not to sound like myself. So instead, I said softly, "I only ever wanted to belong." Her reply came sharp and final. "Then stop making everything about you." There it was again, that familiar twist of guilt. I felt it settle into my chest like an old companion. When I got home that night, I didn't turn on the lights. I sat by the window, watching the city glow in the dark, and for the first time, I let myself feel everything I'd buried: the jealousy, the exhaustion, the small, constant grief of being the daughter who had to dim her light. My phone buzzed. A message from Ethan, my boyfriend. I heard what happened. "I'm coming over." When he arrived, I was still on the floor, the photos cleaned, but the stain on my heart spreading wider. He didn't say much. He just knelt beside me, hands gentle, and started wiping the table with a towel. "They've done this to you your whole life," he said quietly. "I know," I whispered, "but it still hurts like it's new." He lifted my chin, meeting my eyes. "You've spent your life capturing beauty for everyone else. Maybe it's time to create something for yourself." His words lingered in the air, soft but heavy. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, hearing my mother's voice over and over. "Don't come. Don't make this about you." And somewhere between exhaustion and heartbreak, I whispered to the darkness, "If being myself ruins their perfect picture, maybe it's time to take my own." Outside, rain began to fall, gentle at first, then steady. It tapped against the window like a metronome to my racing thoughts. For the first time, I didn't reach for my phone, didn't try to explain, didn't apologize. I just let the rain fall. And deep down beneath all that pain, something small began to move, like the first flicker of light under the surface after a long, cold winter. A quiet knowing, this story isn't over yet. The rain didn't stop for 3 days. It pattered against my window like a reminder that silence can make more noise than words ever will. I spent those days working, editing photos I could barely focus on, convincing myself that if I stayed busy, the pain would stay quiet. But pain doesn't stay quiet. It waits patiently for the smallest sound to wake it. That sound came from my phone one gray afternoon. It was Amanda, my childhood friend, the one person who'd managed to stay close to both me and Lily. "Court, I'm so sorry," she said immediately. "You deserve to know?" Her voice trembled, and I already knew it wasn't going to be good. "Lily's been talking about you. To people. At the bridal luncheon yesterday, she told everyone you used to fake tears to get attention, that you once tried to make her birthday about you." I felt my throat tighten. "That's not true," I said quietly. "I know." But everyone believed her. Even Bradley's parents. "They think you're jealous." The word stung because it was the label they'd always used to justify their cruelty, the label that made their rejection reasonable. Amanda hesitated. "Court, she also told them you were angry because you weren't invited. She said you begged your parents to change their minds." My knees weakened. I sat down on the edge of the bed, the phone pressed to my ear. "I didn't beg," I whispered. "I never begged." "I know you didn't," Amanda said softly, "but she's rewriting the story, and people are listening." When the call ended, I sat in the dim light of my studio, staring at the photo wall I'd built hundreds of couples frozen in love. I'd spent my whole career preserving truth through images, yet my own truth was being rewritten by my own family, and then came the second blow, the one I never saw coming. That evening, I walked into the kitchen where Ethan sat at the table, his laptop open. He jumped slightly when he saw me. "Hey," he said quickly, closing the screen. "Didn't hear you come in?" There was something in his voice too light, too careful. "What are you working on?" I asked. "Just emails. Work stuff." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. When he left to take a shower, I sat down and lifted the laptop lid. The email window was still open. It wasn't work. It was a message thread between him and my mother. My breath caught. "She's been distant, Mom had written. Maybe you can help her understand family comes first. And then Ethan's reply, I'm trying, Margaret. I just want peace between them. She's too emotional right now. I'll talk to her. My hands trembled. I scrolled further. There were more messages, long, careful exchanges. My mother telling him to convince me to see reason, Ethan agreeing to keep her calm. It felt like the floor vanished beneath me. He came out of the bathroom a few minutes later, towel over his shoulder, smiling like nothing had happened. What's wrong? He asked when he saw my face. I turned the screen toward him. His expression changed instantly from calm to panic. Courtney, listen. How long have you been talking to her? It wasn't like that, he said quickly. She reached out after the call. She said she was worried about you. So, you became her messenger? He sighed, rubbing his face. I thought maybe if I could get you to see her side, it would help. I just wanted to make peace that word again. Peace. Peace that always meant my silence. Peace that meant I had to shrink, apologize, disappear. I stepped back, shaking my head. You don't get it. You're not trying to help me, you're helping them keep me small. Courtney, come on, you're overreacting. No, I said, my voice steady now, colder than I'd ever heard it. I'm finally reacting. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The rain outside had turned heavier, hammering against the windows like it wanted in. He whispered, I was just trying to hold this family together. I looked at him, the man who once told me to stop apologizing for who I was. It's not your family to hold, I said. It's mine to survive. That night, I packed a small bag, my camera, a change of clothes, my passport, nothing else. He stood in the doorway, eyes pleading. Please don't do this, he said. You wanted peace, I answered softly. But what I need is freedom. When the door closed behind me, it wasn't anger I felt. It was grief, the quiet, slow kind that seeps into your bones. Driving through the rain, I realized I'd just lost everyone, my family, my partner, the only world I'd known. But for the first time, the emptiness didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like space to finally breathe. I pulled over at a red light, hands trembling on the steering wheel, and whispered, maybe I've been chasing their approval for so long, I forgot I could live without it. And that thought, small, fragile, but real, became the spark that would light the rest of my story. Because sometimes the worst betrayals don't end you, they free you. The rain finally stopped the next morning. Seattle was washed clean, the sky pale, the streets glistening, but I didn't feel renewed. I felt hollow, like someone had scraped away everything I thought I was and left me staring at the outline. I hadn't spoken to anyone since leaving Ethan's apartment. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from my mother, from Lily, even from Ethan, all variations of, you'll regret this. But I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I did something strange. I went for a walk. The air was cold, sharp against my skin, the kind of cold that makes you remember you're still alive. I wandered without direction until I found myself standing outside a little travel agency, the kind with faded posters of places too beautiful to be real. Amalfi Coast, Tuscany, Lake Como. Something about the word Amalfi caught my eye. Maybe it was the memory of an old email from Giovanni, the Italian filmmaker I'd once assisted on a documentary. He used to say, Italy isn't a country, Courtney. It's a feeling. I stepped inside. A woman with silver hair and kind eyes looked up. Can I help you, dear? I hesitated, realizing I didn't even know what I wanted. Maybe, I said softly. I think I need to see something beautiful again. She smiled, like she understood more than I said. Then Italy is waiting. That night, I opened my old laptop. The inbox was cluttered, but there it was, an unread message from Giovanni, dated 2 months earlier. If you ever come back to Italy, my family villa in Amalfi is open to you. It overlooks the sea at sunset, the kind of light you always chased through your lens. I stared at the message for a long time, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat. Then, without thinking, I replied, "Giovanni, is it still available?" His answer came within an hour. "For you, always." And that was it. A single click, a single decision, and my life began to move again. 2 weeks later, I stood on the balcony of a stone villa perched high above the Mediterranean. The air smelled like salt and jasmine. Below me, the sea shimmered gold, as if it had stolen the sun. Giovanni greeted me with a hug that smelled of espresso and olive oil. "Ah, Courtney. You see? The light here forgives everything," I smiled, though my heart was still heavy. "I'm not sure it can forgive me." "Then maybe you don't need forgiveness," he said, touching his chest. "Maybe you need to start your own story." That night, I unpacked my camera and wandered the terrace. I watched the way the light kissed the old walls, the way the sea kept breathing even after the sun went down. For years I'd photographed other people's happiness, but standing there, barefoot on cool stone, I realized I'd never once captured my own. The next morning, I woke before dawn. The horizon glowed faintly pink. I set my camera on the railing and turned it toward myself. No makeup, no posing, just me. The shutter clicked once. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. I sent the photo to Giovanni with a short message. "Maybe this is what starting over looks like." He replied minutes later. "Then make it official. Have your own wedding to life." I laughed, but the idea didn't leave me. The more I thought about it, the more it felt right. For so long I'd been waiting for someone else to give me permission to belong. Maybe the only person I ever needed approval from was myself. That evening, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, I walked into town and bought a simple white dress from a local shop linen, soft, flowing. The shopkeeper tilted her head and asked, "For a wedding?" I smiled. "For a beginning." I wrote my vows that night on hotel stationery. No audience, no altar, just words I needed to finally say aloud. I promised to stop apologizing for my own light. I promised to love myself the way I've loved everyone else patiently, without conditions. The next day, Giovanni offered to help. "Every woman deserves witnesses to her rebirth," he said. He invited 2 of his friends, an elderly florist named Lucia, and her husband Marco, who played guitar. At sunset, they met me on the terrace. The sea glowed amber, the jasmine vines swayed in the wind. Lucia handed me a small bouquet of wildflowers and said, "For courage." I stood barefoot as Marco played a soft Italian melody and Giovanni lifted his camera. "Ready?" he asked. I nodded, tears catching the light. The shutter clicked. Once, twice. In that moment, I wasn't the daughter who wasn't invited, or the girlfriend betrayed. I wasn't anyone's shadow. I was simply a woman who had finally chosen herself. When Giovanni lowered the camera, he whispered, "Perfetto, you just married your freedom." The 3 of them clapped quietly, and we toasted with cheap Prosecco under a sky full of stars. Later that night, I sat alone on the balcony, listening to the waves below. For the first time in months, my chest didn't ache. The sea seemed to breathe with me. And as I looked at the photo Giovanni had taken me, standing in the golden light, eyes closed, smiling softly, I realized something. I didn't need their permission to exist in color. For a while, life in Amalfi felt like a dream that refused to fade. Mornings began with the smell of espresso and jasmine. Evenings ended with the sea whispering against the cliffs, soft as forgiveness. I thought the noise from home had finally stopped until my phone rang one afternoon. "Mom." I almost didn't answer, but the part of me that still hoped the little girl who used to draw hearts on her mother's birthday cards couldn't resist. "Courtney," she said sharply, skipping any pretense of warmth, "I heard you're doing something in Italy." "I am," I replied calmly. "Something for myself." "A wedding?" she snapped. "Right before Lily's?" "You're unbelievable." Her words hit me like cold water. I turned toward the sea, watching the horizon blur. "It's not about Lily. It's about peace." "Peace?" she repeated, her voice rising. "You've humiliated this family." "People are calling, asking what kind of daughter would try to steal her sister's spotlight." There it was, again, the narrative she'd always mastered. I could almost hear her rehearsing it. The difficult child, the selfish one, the disappointment. "Mom," I said softly, "you've been telling people who I am for years, but you've never once asked." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was electric, heavy with truth she didn't want to face. Then another voice joined the call. "Dad." "Court," he said, weary. "Can't you just postpone it? Do this after Lily's big day? Why must you always challenge your mother?" "Because she's wrong," I said quietly. "And so are you." Mom's tone sharpened again. "If you go through with this, don't bother coming home. You'll be choosing strangers over your own family." I looked around the terrace, the old stone walls, the sunlight, the wildflowers Lucia had left that morning. These weren't strangers. They were the first people who had ever seen me without judgment. "Maybe home isn't where you're born," I said. "Maybe it's where you're finally allowed to breathe." The line went dead. Within hours, my phone flooded with messages, cousins, aunts, even Lily. Lily's text was short, "You've really gone too far this time." And then another, minutes later, "Mom says you're doing this to hurt me. Is that true?" I stared at the screen, feeling that familiar ache in my chest, love tangled with pain. I typed slowly, "No, Lily, I'm doing this so I can finally stop hurting myself." When I hit send, something inside me settled. That night, Giovanni found me sitting on the terrace in the dark. "You're quiet," he said, handing me a glass of wine. "They think I'm destroying the family," I whispered. "Maybe you are," he replied gently. "But perhaps it's a family that needed to break." His words landed deep like the truth I'd been circling around all along. Because sometimes peace isn't found in keeping what breaks you. It's found in letting it go. The morning of my ceremony arrived quietly. The air was cool, carrying the scent of salt and blooming jasmine. Down below, the Mediterranean shimmered like glass, endless and calm, as if the whole sea had been waiting for this moment. I slipped into the simple white dress I'd bought in town. It wasn't silk or lace, just linen soft against my skin. My hair fell loosely over my shoulders. No veil, no diamonds, no audience, only truth. Lucia, the florist, helped fasten the last button. "You look radiant," she whispered. I smiled. For the first time, I feel like myself. On the terrace, Giovanni adjusted his old camera. "Whenever you're ready," he said softly. I stood barefoot beneath the olive tree, the sea stretching wide behind me. The sun had begun to dip, painting everything gold, that magical hour photographers chase their whole lives. I took a deep breath, feeling my heart steady for the first time in months. And then I spoke, not to anyone else, but to the girl I had once been. "You tried so hard to be loved, to be chosen, to be small enough to fit, but you were never the problem. You were the light they didn't know how to handle." The wind caught my words and carried them toward the sea. Giovanni's camera clicked once. The sound felt like closure. We toasted with cheap Prosecco and laughter that echoed into the evening. For the first time, joy didn't feel borrowed, it belonged to me. As the sky turned violet, Giovanni showed me the photograph he'd taken. I stood in the golden light, barefoot and smiling, not posing, not pretending, just being. The sea behind me glowed like it was applauding. "You see?" he said. "When a woman stops asking for permission to exist, the world finally sees her." That night, I uploaded the photo not to prove anything, but to mark a beginning. I captioned it simply, "The day I married freedom." It spread faster than I expected. Messages poured in from women, strangers, mothers, daughters saying they'd cried, saying they finally understood what it meant to stand tall after being made small. And if you've ever felt unseen, if someone has ever tried to dim your light, this moment is for you. Please like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Because when one of us stands up, we all shine a little brighter. As I watched the waves shimmer below, I whispered the words that had carried me here. When people try to make you smaller, that's when you stand tallest. And this time, I believed them.